The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Community Center as Margaret stepped through the front doors for the first time. She carried a simple brown bag with her lunch and wore a plain blue cardigan over her modest dress. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her worn sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished floor. She was 52 years old, and this was her first day as a volunteer. "You must be the new helper," said a woman behind the reception desk without looking up from her computer. "I'm Beverly. Mrs. Holloway is in the main hall. Just go straight and turn left." Margaret nodded quietly and followed the directions. The community center was bigger than she'd expected, with cream-colored walls decorated with children's artwork and faded photographs of past events. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from somewhere down the hallway, mixing with the faint scent of cleaning products. She found Mrs. Holloway in a large room with hardwood floors, arranging folding chairs in neat rows. The woman was in her late 50s, dressed in an expensive-looking pantsuit, and moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't like to waste time. "Oh good, you're here," Mrs. Holloway said, barely glancing at Margaret. "We need these chairs set up before noon. The music appreciation class starts at 1. Can you handle that?" "Yes, of course," Margaret replied softly. "And after that, the practice rooms need tidying. People leave sheet music everywhere. Just stack anything you find on the shelves." Mrs. Holloway checked her watch. "I have a meeting with the board. If you need anything, ask Beverly." Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Holloway was already walking away, her heels clicking against the floor. Margaret looked at the stack of folding chairs still leaning against the wall. There had to be at least 40 more to set up. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The chairs were heavier than they looked, and her hands weren't as strong as they used to be. But she worked steadily, creating even rows that faced a small raised platform at the front of the room. Occasionally people passed by in the hallway, but no one stopped to help or even say hello. Around 11:30, 3 people entered the room, deep in conversation. They were clearly the music teachers Mrs. Holloway had mentioned. The first was a woman in her 40s with dark hair and a colorful scarf, carrying a stack of folders. The second was a younger man with glasses who looked barely 30, holding a violin case. The third was an older gentleman with silver hair swept back dramatically, wearing a tweed jacket with elbow patches. "I'm telling you, Professor Ashworth," the woman was saying, "we're not going to find anyone in this town who can play at that level." "My dear Ms. Rodriguez," the older man replied in a pompous tone, "we've managed for 15 years. We'll manage again." "But the charity concert is only 3 weeks away," the younger man added, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Last year's pianist moved to California. We don't have a backup." They walked right past Margaret as if she were invisible, continuing their discussion as they approached the platform. Margaret quietly finished the last row of chairs and began gathering the empty coffee cups someone had left on the windowsill. "Mr. Kim, you worry too much," Professor Ashworth said, waving his hand dismissively. "The concert will be fine. We'll find someone adequate. We always do." "Adequate?" Ms. Rodriguez shook her head. "The mayor is coming this year. The press will be there. We can't just have someone adequate." Margaret carried the cups toward the door, but Professor Ashworth's voice stopped her. "You there?" he called out. "Yes, you, the volunteer." Margaret turned around. "Yes?" "When you're done with whatever you're doing, we'll need coffee. 3 cups. Mine with cream, no sugar." He didn't wait for her response before turning back to his colleagues. "I'll see what I can do," Margaret said quietly, though she wasn't sure anyone heard her. She spent the next hour preparing the practice rooms. The community center had 3 small rooms, each containing an upright piano and music stands. As Mrs. Holloway had predicted, sheet music was scattered everywhere. Margaret picked up each piece carefully, noticing the compositions as she organized them. Beethoven sonatas, Chopin etudes, some beginner exercises. Her fingers tingled slightly as she touched the paper, muscle memory stirring after years of dormancy. In the third practice room, she paused. Unlike the upright pianos in the other rooms, this one held a beautiful grand piano. It wasn't new. The black finish showed signs of age, but it was well maintained. Margaret found herself standing beside it, her hand hovering just above the keys without touching them. "Do you play?" a voice asked from the doorway. Margaret turned to find Ms. Rodriguez watching her with mild curiosity. "Oh, I know a little about music," Margaret said, pulling her hand back quickly. Ms. Rodriguez smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's nice. Most of our volunteers don't know anything about it. Makes it harder to explain what we need." She stepped into the room and placed her folders on top of the piano. "Did Mrs. Holloway tell you about the charity concert?" "No, she didn't mention it. We hold it every year. It's quite a big deal for the town. Raises money for music scholarships for kids who can't afford lessons." Ms. Rodriguez sighed. "This year is going to be challenging, though. We lost our best performers, and the program is already set. We're supposed to feature some difficult, classical pieces, but I don't know where we'll find someone capable of playing them." Margaret nodded, unsure what to say. "Anyway," Ms. Rodriguez continued, gathering her folders, "if you could make sure this room stays tidy, that would be helpful. Professor Ashworth uses this space for his advanced students. He's very particular about it." "I understand." After Ms. Rodriguez left, Margaret allowed herself one more look at the grand piano. Her fingers ached with the desire to touch the keys, to feel them respond to her touch, to hear the sound they would make. But she turned away and continued her work. The afternoon brought more tasks. She helped set up refreshments for the music appreciation class, wiped down tables, and restocked supplies in the storage closet. The teachers ignored her mostly, occasionally asking her to fetch something or clean up after their students. Professor Ashworth was particularly demanding, speaking to her as if she were incapable of understanding simple instructions. "The cups go in the blue bin, not the regular trash," he told her slowly, as if speaking to a child. "We recycle here. Do you understand recycling?" "Yes, I understand," Margaret replied patiently. As the day wound down and the last class ended, Margaret found herself alone in the main hall, pushing a broom across the floor. The building had grown quiet, with most people already gone for the evening. Through the open door of the practice room, she could see the grand piano sitting in the soft light of the late afternoon sun. She walked to the doorway and stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. Her hands remembered things her mind tried to forget. The weight of the keys, the perfect pressure needed for each note, the way music could pour out of her fingers like water from a spring. But that was a lifetime ago. Now she was just Margaret, the volunteer who set up chairs and made coffee. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all she needed to be. She turned off the light in the practice room and closed the door gently behind her, leaving the piano alone in the darkness. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret started volunteering at the community center, and she'd fallen into a comfortable routine. She arrived at 8 each morning, set up rooms, cleaned, and helped wherever needed. The teachers had grown used to her presence, though they rarely acknowledged her beyond giving instructions. She'd become part of the background, like the furniture or the potted plants in the hallway. On this particular Tuesday morning, Margaret arrived to find an unusual tension in the air. Beverly at the front desk was on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Mrs. Holloway rushed past without her usual composed demeanor, her face tight with worry. Something was wrong. Margaret went about her morning tasks, but the anxiety in the building was impossible to ignore. Small groups of people clustered in hallways, whispering. Ms. Rodriguez passed by looking distraught, barely noticing when Margaret greeted her. By mid-morning, Margaret learned what had happened. The pianist scheduled to perform at the charity concert had called that morning from the hospital. A car accident. Nothing life-threatening, thankfully, but both hands were injured. The doctor said no piano playing for at least 3 months. The concert was in 5 days. Margaret was wiping down tables in the main hall when she heard raised voices coming from Mrs. Holloway's office. The door was slightly open, and though she didn't mean to eavesdrop, the volume made it impossible not to hear. "This is a disaster," Mrs. Holloway was saying. "The mayor confirmed last week. We've sold over 300 tickets. The program features Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, for heaven's sake. We can't just cancel." "We've called every pianist within 100 miles, Ms. Rodriguez replied, her voice strained. "No one is available on such short notice. And even if they were, that piece requires months of preparation. It's one of the most difficult in the entire classical repertoire." What about your student, Mr. Kim? Mrs. Holloway asked. The one who won that regional competition? She's 17 and still learning advanced pieces, Mr. Kim said quietly. Rachmaninoff 3 would destroy her confidence. It's too much. There was a long silence. Margaret continued wiping the same spot on the table, her cloth moving in slow circles. Well, Professor Ashworth's voice boomed, dripping with sarcasm. Perhaps we should ask the cleaning lady to play. I'm sure she'd do a wonderful job. Margaret's hand stopped moving. Her chest tightened. That's not helpful, Professor, Ms. Rodriguez said. I'm merely pointing out the absurdity of our situation, he continued. We're desperately searching for a pianist when we can't even find someone adequate in normal circumstances. Perhaps we should lower our standards entirely. Have a volunteer stumble through chopsticks for the mayor. The others didn't laugh. Margaret heard papers shuffling, chairs scraping against the floor. We need to think creatively, Mrs. Holloway said finally. There has to be a solution. Margaret moved away from the office, her heart pounding in a way she didn't quite understand. She busied herself in the storage closet, organizing supplies that didn't need organizing, trying to calm the strange feeling rising in her chest. An hour later, she was in the practice room dusting the grand piano when Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway. The director's face was drawn, exhausted. Margaret, she said, and there was something different in her tone, a desperation that hadn't been there before. Can I ask you something? Margaret set down her dustcloth. Of course. Mrs. Holloway stepped into the room, glancing at the piano. You mentioned once that you know a little about music. Do you? Can you play piano at all? Margaret's throat went dry. It's been a very long time. But you can play? Even a little bit? Mrs. Holloway moved closer, her eyes searching Margaret's face. I'm sure you've heard about our situation. The concert is in 5 days and we have no pianist. I know it's asking a lot, but could you possibly play something? Anything? Even if it's simple, we could adjust the program. We just need someone at that piano. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were older now, with faint age spots and veins that showed through the skin, but the fingers were still long, still strong in their way. I don't think I'm what you're looking for, Margaret said softly. Please, Mrs. Holloway said, and the word carried real desperation. We're out of options. The scholarship fund depends on this concert. 20 children are waiting to start lessons next month with that money. I'm not asking for perfection, just something. Before Margaret could respond, Professor Ashworth's voice came from the hallway. Are you seriously considering this, Patricia? He entered the room with Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Kim behind him. All three teachers stared at Margaret with varying expressions. Professor Ashworth looked amused, as if watching an entertaining joke unfold. Ms. Rodriguez seemed uncertain, perhaps embarrassed by the situation. Mr. Kim just looked tired. We're desperate, Mrs. Holloway said firmly. If Margaret can play anything serviceable, we'll make it work. Professor Ashworth laughed, a sharp, unkind sound. This is ridiculous. The program lists Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written. And you want to put someone who knows a little about music on that stage? We'll change the program, Mrs. Holloway said. To what? Mary Had a Little Lamb? Professor Ashworth shook his head. This will be humiliating. For everyone involved. Margaret felt heat rising in her face, not from anger but from something else, something she'd buried for 30 years. Maybe we should just let her try, Ms. Rodriguez suggested gently. What do we have to lose at this point? Professor Ashworth gestured theatrically toward the piano. By all means, let's see what our volunteer can do. Margaret, was it? Please sit down. Show us your skills. There was mockery in his voice, barely concealed. He was enjoying this, Margaret realized. The chance to prove his point, to show how foolish this idea was. I really don't think... Margaret began. Oh, come now, Professor Ashworth interrupted, walking to the piano bench and patting it. Don't be modest. Mrs. Holloway asked you to play. We're all waiting. Margaret looked at the 4 people watching her. Mrs. Holloway with desperate hope, Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Kim with polite uncertainty, Professor Ashworth with barely hidden contempt. She thought about walking away, making an excuse, keeping her secret safe. But something had shifted in the past 2 weeks. Being around music again, even just organizing sheet music and dusting pianos, had awakened something she thought was dead. and Professor Ashworth's smug expression reminded her of every person who had ever underestimated someone based on their appearance. "What would you like me to play?" Margaret asked quietly. Professor Ashworth's eyebrows rose. "Oh, you're actually going to try? How delightful." He walked to the shelf and pulled out a thick book of sheet music. "Well, since we need someone to play Rachmaninoff, let's see how you handle it." He placed the music on the piano stand and opened it to a page dense with notes. The Piano Concerto No. 3. The piece pianist called one of the most difficult ever composed. The piece that required superhuman technical skill and endurance. "This is the opening movement," Professor Ashworth said, his smile widening. "Take your time. We'll wait." Ms. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should start with something simpler." "Nonsense," Professor Ashworth said. "If she's going to perform in 5 days, we need to know what she can do." "Margaret doesn't mind, do you?" Margaret looked at the sheet music. She hadn't seen this piece in decades, but her mind still knew every note, every chord, every run, every impossible passage that had once been as natural to her as breathing. She sat down on the bench. Her hands positioned themselves over the keys, and for a moment she simply sat there, feeling the familiar curve of ivory under her fingertips. The piano waited, patient and silent. Professor Ashworth stood behind her with his arms crossed, ready to laugh. Mrs. Holloway held her breath. Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Kim exchanged glances. Margaret closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and let 30 years of silence fall away. Her fingers touched the keys, and everything changed. The first notes came softly, almost hesitantly, as if Margaret's fingers were remembering something they'd forgotten long ago. The opening melody of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the small practice room with a gentle melancholy. Professor Ashworth's smirk remained fixed on his face. This was exactly what he'd expected. A timid, uncertain attempt that would prove his point within seconds. But then something happened. Margaret's posture shifted. Her shoulders straightened. Her back lifted. The uncertain quality vanished from her playing, replaced by something that made the air in the room feel different. Her fingers began to move faster, surer, dancing across the keys with a precision that seemed impossible. The music swelled. The gentle opening gave way to the first cascade of notes, a torrent of sound that demanded absolute technical mastery. Margaret's hands moved independently, the left hand laying down deep, resonant chords while the right hand flew through passages that most pianists spent months perfecting. Professor Ashworth's smirk disappeared. His mouth opened slightly. Ms. Rodriguez took a step closer, her eyes wide. Mr. Kim's hand went to his chest, as if the music had physically struck him. Margaret's fingers raced through the notorious octave runs, those sections that separated amateur pianists from professionals. Her hand stretched across the keys, hitting each note with crystalline clarity. Not a single mistake, not a single hesitation. The difficult became effortless. The impossible became inevitable. Mrs. Holloway sank slowly into a nearby chair, her hand covering her mouth. The music built in intensity. Margaret's whole body moved with the piece now, swaying slightly, her face transformed. She was no longer the quiet volunteer in the worn cardigan. She was someone else entirely, someone who belonged to the music and the music belonged to her. The practice room seemed too small to contain the sound. Notes bounced off the walls, filled every corner, spilled out into the hallway. People walking by stopped in their tracks. Beverly left her desk at the front entrance and moved toward the sound, drawn like a magnet. Students from the afternoon classes gathered in the doorway, pressing close to see who was creating this miracle. Margaret reached the most technically demanding section of the first movement, a passage that even concert pianists approached with fear. Her fingers moved so fast they blurred. The left hand jumped across the lower registers while the right hand executed runs that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Each note rang clear and true, building upon the last, creating a wall of sound that was both terrifyingly complex and achingly beautiful. Professor Ashworth had gone pale. He gripped the edge of a music stand as if needing support. The music shifted into the lyrical section and Margaret's playing changed with it. The aggressive technical display gave way to such tender emotion that Ms. Rodriguez felt tears forming in her eyes. Each phrase was shaped with perfect sensitivity, the melody singing out above the accompaniment like a human voice telling a story of loss and longing. More people crowded into the doorway. A maintenance worker stood with his mop forgotten in his hand. A mother who'd been waiting to pick up her child stood frozen, her car keys dangling from her fingers. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply listened, bearing witness to something extraordinary. Margaret's hands knew exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to let a note breathe, and when to rush forward. This wasn't someone who'd learned the piece recently. This was someone who'd lived inside this music, who'd made it part of her soul. The first movement built toward its powerful conclusion. Margaret's arms rose and fell, attacking the keys with controlled force that produced sound both massive and precise. The piano seemed to roar and whisper simultaneously. The final cadenza approached, that section where the pianist plays alone, unaccompanied, demonstrating pure virtuosity. Margaret's fingers flew through passages that could make professional pianists weep with their difficulty. Ascending runs, descending runs, massive chords that required hands to stretch beyond what seemed anatomically possible. She executed them all flawlessly, her face serene despite the physical demands of the music. The movement rushed toward its final chords. Margaret's hands came down with perfect force and the last notes rang out, sustaining in the air like bells. She held the final chord, her foot on the sustained pedal, letting the sound decay naturally. Then silence. Margaret's hands remained on the keys, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Slowly, she lifted her fingers and placed them in her lap. She stared at the keyboard as if surprised to find herself there. For a long moment, no one in the room moved or spoke. The silence felt sacred, fragile, like something that might shatter if disturbed too quickly. Professor Ashworth found his voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" Margaret didn't answer. She continued staring at the piano keys, her expression unreadable. That was... Mr. Kim tried to speak but couldn't find words. He shook his head in disbelief. "I've never heard anyone play like that, not live. Only in recordings of the greatest pianists in the world." Ms. Rodriguez moved closer, her face still showing traces of tears. "Margaret, where did you learn to play like that? That level of skill? That's not something you can hide. That's years of training at the highest level." Mrs. Holloway stood up from the chair, her legs unsteady. "You said you knew a little about music. That was beyond professional. That was..." She struggled to find adequate words. "That was world class." The crowd in the doorway began to murmur. Someone was recording on their phone. Someone else was already texting, spreading word of what they'd just witnessed. Margaret slowly stood up from the piano bench. She looked smaller now, as if the act of playing had temporarily made her larger, and now she was shrinking back to her normal size. She smoothed down her cardigan with trembling hands. "It's been a long time," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure I could still do it." Professor Ashworth took a step forward, and for the first time since Margaret had met him, he looked genuinely humble. "A long time since you've played? You just executed one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire perfectly. Not well, perfectly. I've heard professionals attempt that piece and fail. You didn't miss a single note. Your technique is..." He paused, shaking his head. "Who taught you?" Margaret looked at him with sad eyes. "That's not important anymore." "Not important?" Ms. Rodriguez's voice rose slightly. "Margaret, people spend their entire lives trying to play at that level. That's not just talent. That's elite training, conservatory training. You didn't just take lessons at some local music school. You studied with masters." The room felt thick with questions, with curiosity, with the weight of a mystery suddenly revealed but not yet explained. Everyone waited for Margaret to speak, to explain, to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Beverly pushed her way through the crowd in the doorway. "Margaret, dear, are you all right? You look like you might faint." Margaret did feel faint. Her hands were shaking harder now. Playing again after so many years had broken open something inside her, something she'd worked very hard to keep sealed. Memories were flooding back, ones she'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. "I need some air," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. She moved toward the door, but Mrs. Holloway stepped into her path. "Margaret, please. We need to understand. We need to know who you are." Margaret looked at the director, then at the 3 teachers, then at all the faces crowded in the doorway staring at her with wonder and confusion. She'd wanted to stay invisible, to live quietly, to leave her past buried. But the moment her fingers had touched those keys, invisibility had become impossible. My name, she said slowly, is Margaret Chen. That's all you need to know. Chen? Professor Ashworth repeated, his eyes narrowing as his mind worked. Margaret Chen. Why does that name sound familiar? Margaret's expression tightened. She could see the recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes. Professor Ashworth stood perfectly still, his face going through a series of expressions as his mind raced backward through decades of classical music history. Margaret Chen, he repeated slowly. Wait, Chen, Margaret Chen Williams? Margaret closed her eyes. The name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 30 years hung in the air between them. It can't be, Professor Ashworth whispered, his voice losing all its usual pompousness. Margaret Chen Williams disappeared from the concert circuit in the mid-90s. She was... He looked at Margaret with new eyes, seeing her differently now. She was being called the greatest pianist of her generation. Ms. Rodriguez gasped. The Margaret Chen Williams? From Juilliard? But she would be... She calculated quickly in her head, looking at Margaret. She would be about your age now. Mr. Kim pulled out his phone with shaking hands and started typing. Within seconds, his face went white. It's her. There are old photos. From performances in Vienna, London, Tokyo. He held up his phone, showing a black and white photograph of a young woman in an elegant gown, seated at a concert grand piano. The face was younger, unlined, but unmistakably Margaret's. The crowd in the doorway pressed closer, whispers spreading like wildfire. Beverly looked at Margaret with her mouth open, unable to process what she was hearing. Mrs. Holloway sank back into her chair. This whole time, you've been here for 2 weeks and you're Margaret Chen Williams. You performed with the Berlin Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic. You played for presidents and queens. That was a different life, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. A different person, different person. Professor Ashworth's voice cracked. You don't just stop being one of the greatest pianists in the world. That kind of talent doesn't disappear. What happened? Why did you vanish? Margaret looked at the piano, at the keys that had just brought her past flooding back. She'd known this moment would come if she ever played again. She'd known the questions would follow, but knowing didn't make it easier. I'd rather not talk about it, she said, rather not talk about it. Ms. Rodriguez moved closer, her voice gentle but insistent. Margaret, you were famous. There are articles about you in every major music publication. Critics called you the next Martha Argerich. You recorded with major labels. Then suddenly, 30 years ago, you just stopped. No explanation. No farewell tour. You disappeared completely. People wondered if you'd died. In a way I did, Margaret said softly. The room fell silent. Even the whispers in the doorway stopped. Mr. Kim lowered his phone. What do you mean? Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, at the ordinary view of an ordinary town where she'd built her quiet, invisible life. I was 22 years old, she began, her voice distant. I'd just finished recording Rachmaninoff's complete concertos. The reviews were incredible. My manager was booking performances 2 years in advance. Everyone said I had a golden future ahead of me. She paused, and the silence stretched so long that people began to wonder if she would continue. I was married, Margaret finally said. His name was David. We met at Juilliard. He was a violinist, not as talented as me, but he understood the music world. We had a daughter, Lily. She was 4 years old. She had my eyes and David's smile, and she loved to dance while I practiced. Ms. Rodriguez's expression softened with sudden understanding. Her hand went to her heart. We were driving home from a performance in Boston, Margaret continued, her voice growing quieter. It was snowing. The roads were bad, but David said we'd be fine. We'd driven in worse. We were talking about Lily's birthday party, about what kind of cake she wanted. Then there were headlights coming toward us in our lane. A drunk driver. David tried to swerve. No one in the room moved. Beverly had tears streaming down her face. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, Margaret said. Both my hands were broken, but the doctor said they'd heal fine. They said I was lucky. Lucky. Her voice caught on the word. David and Lily died on impact. They said it was instant, that they didn't suffer. People kept telling me how lucky I was. Mrs. Holloway pressed her hand to her mouth, tears in her eyes. I couldn't play after that, Margaret continued. My hands healed perfectly, but every time I sat at a piano, all I could see was them. David listening to me practice, proud and supportive. Lily spinning in circles, her little dress twirling. The piano became a monument to everything I'd lost. The music felt like poison. Professor Ashworth had lowered himself into a chair, his face stricken. All his earlier arrogance had evaporated completely. I tried to keep performing, Margaret said. My manager said it would help me heal, that the music would save me. I played a concert in Carnegie Hall 6 months after the accident. I got through the first movement of the piece. Then I broke down on stage in front of 2,000 people. I couldn't continue. I walked off and never went back. What did you do? Mr. Kim asked gently. I disappeared, Margaret said simply. I moved from city to city for years. I worked ordinary jobs, waitress, bookkeeper, library assistant. I avoided anything connected to classical music. I changed my name back to just Margaret Chen, dropped the Williams. I wanted to erase that part of my life completely. But you kept playing, Ms. Rodriguez said. You had to have kept practicing to maintain that level of skill. Margaret nodded slowly. Late at night when no one could hear. In motel rooms with keyboards and headphones. In churches after hours when I could sneak in. I couldn't stop completely. The music was too much a part of me. But I played only for myself, for the memories, for the ghosts. Never for an audience. Never in daylight. She turned from the window to face them all. I came to this town 5 years ago. I rented a small apartment and found work at a grocery store. I lived quietly. No one knew who I was or who I'd been. Then I retired last year and wanted something to do with my time. I saw the volunteer notice for this community center and thought it would be safe. I'd be around music but not part of it. I could dust pianos but never play them. Until today, Mrs. Holloway said. Until today, Margaret agreed. And the moment I started playing, I knew I'd made a mistake. I knew this would happen. The questions. The past coming back. Professor Ashworth stood up slowly. He walked toward Margaret, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I mocked you. I treated you like you were invisible, like you were beneath me. I called you the cleaning lady. I forced you to play as a joke. His face crumpled with shame. I am so deeply sorry. You didn't know, Margaret said. That's no excuse, he replied. I should treat everyone with respect, regardless of who they are or what they do. The fact that you turned out to be one of the greatest pianists alive only makes my behavior more embarrassing. But it was wrong from the beginning. Ms. Rodriguez wiped her eyes. What do we do now? The concert is in 5 days. You could play. You could perform again. I don't know if I can, Margaret said honestly. I don't know if I'm ready. Mr. Kim stepped forward. You don't have to decide now. Take time, think about it. But Margaret, what you just played, that was more than technique. That was pure emotion. Raw and real. You haven't lost anything. If anything, you've gained something. Depth. Pain and survival make the music mean more. Margaret looked at all of them, at their faces filled with compassion and hope and regret. She thought about the piano in the practice room, about how it felt to play again after hiding for so long. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment, looking at the photograph she kept in her nightstand drawer. David and Lily at the beach, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. She'd taken that picture the summer before the accident. Looking at it used to feel like drowning. Tonight it felt different, like maybe she could look at their faces and remember the joy instead of only the loss. Her phone had been ringing all evening. Somehow the news had spread beyond the community center. Old colleagues from the music world had tracked down her number. Journalists wanted interviews. A recording company left 3 messages. She ignored them all except one. Mrs. Holloway had called just to check on her, not to pressure her about the concert. Whatever you decide, she'd said, we're grateful to know you. The real you. That simple kindness had made Margaret cry for the first time in years. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the community center early. She'd made her decision during the sleepless night, though she still felt uncertain about it. The building was quiet, most of the staff not yet arrived. She walked to the practice room and found Professor Ashworth already there, sitting on the piano bench with his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, his eyes red-rimmed. I couldn't sleep, he said. I kept thinking about all the times I was cruel to you. Not just you, but other people. Students who weren't talented enough. Volunteers who didn't understand music theory. I've spent my whole life thinking my knowledge of music made me superior. Then you showed me what real mastery looks like, and I realized I've been a fool. Margaret sat down beside him on the bench. We all have regrets, Professor. Things we wish we could change. Call me Henry, he said quietly. I don't deserve the title right now. He looked at the piano keys. Are you going to play at the concert? Margaret took a deep breath. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to, but another part is terrified. When I played yesterday, all the memories came back, good and bad. I'm not sure I can handle that in front of hundreds of people. Henry nodded. I understand. And for what it's worth, you don't owe us anything. You certainly don't owe me anything after how I treated you. They sat in silence for a moment, two people connected by music and regret. Why do you teach? Margaret asked suddenly. Henry seemed surprised by the question. I suppose because I love music. Even though I was never good enough to perform professionally, I wanted to stay close to it somehow. That's not a small thing, Margaret said. Teaching matters. Passing on knowledge matters. You may not perform, but you create performers. That's its own kind of legacy. Henry looked at her with grateful eyes. Thank you for saying that. Over the next 3 days, Margaret spent hours in the practice room. Word had spread through town about who she really was, and people would gather quietly in the hallway to listen when she played. She didn't perform full pieces, just sections, reacquainting herself with the feeling of playing for others, even if they couldn't see her. Ms. Rodriguez visited her each day, bringing tea and sitting quietly while Margaret worked through difficult passages. Mr. Kim brought his advanced students to listen, teaching them that technical skill meant nothing without emotion behind it. Even Beverly would sneak away from the front desk to stand in the doorway, tears in her eyes. The night before the concert, Margaret sat alone in the practice room. The building was empty, everyone gone home. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes, thinking about David and Lily, thinking about the life she'd lost and the life she'd built in its wake. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered to the empty room. I don't know if I'm strong enough. But then she remembered something David had told her once years ago. The music doesn't belong to you, he'd said. You're just the channel it flows through. Your job is to get out of the way and let it speak. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe she didn't need to be strong. Maybe she just needed to step aside and let the music do what it was meant to do. The concert hall was packed the next evening. News of Margaret's identity had spread through the classical music community like lightning. Critics who'd written about her 30 years ago had flown in from other cities. Former colleagues sat in the audience with tears already in their eyes. The mayor was there and the press, but also regular people from town who'd simply heard something beautiful was going to happen. Backstage, Margaret stood in a simple black dress, her hands shaking. Mrs. Holloway stood beside her along with Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Kim, and Henry. You can still back out, Mrs. Holloway said gently. No one would blame you. Margaret shook her head. No, I need to do this for them. For David and Lily. They loved hearing me play. I stopped playing for audiences when I lost them, but maybe that was wrong. Maybe the best way to honor them is to share what they loved about me with the world. Henry squeezed her shoulder. You're the bravest person I've ever met. I'm terrified, Margaret admitted. That's what makes it brave, he replied. The lights dimmed in the concert hall. Margaret walked onto the stage and the audience rose to their feet, before she'd even reached the piano. The applause was thunderous, filled with decades of anticipation and welcome. She saw people crying, saw recognition on so many faces. She sat at the concert grand, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the sea of faces. For a moment, the fear threatened to overwhelm her. But then she saw 2 empty seats in the front row, and she understood. Those seats were for David and Lily. They were here in the only way they could be. In her heart, in her memory, in the music. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hall, and it was as if time collapsed. The scared woman who'd been hiding for 30 years and the brilliant young pianist who'd lost everything merged into one person. Someone who'd survived. Someone who'd carried grief and still found a way to create beauty. She played with technical perfection. But that wasn't what made the audience weep. She played with the weight of loss, with the ache of memory, with the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. Every note carried story. Every phrase held meaning. The difficult passages that had intimidated pianists for generations flowed from her fingers like water. But between the notes, in the spaces and the silence, there was something more. There was life. Real, painful, beautiful life. When she reached the final chords, she held them, letting them ring out into the hall, letting them carry all the grief and joy and survival she'd kept locked inside for 3 decades. The last note faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, building like a wave, crashing over her. People stood crying openly, clapping until their hands hurt. The ovation lasted 10 minutes, then 15. Margaret sat at the piano, tears streaming down her face, accepting the love the audience was giving her. After the concert, she found Henry backstage. He was crying too, unashamed. "That was perfect," he said. "That was everything music should be." "Thank you," Margaret said, "for pushing me. Even though you did it for the wrong reasons, it led me here. And I needed to be here." In the weeks that followed, Margaret received offers to perform around the world. Recording contracts, interview requests, invitations to prestigious concert halls. She turned them all down. Instead, she started teaching piano to children at the community center. Kids whose families couldn't afford private lessons. Kids who showed promise but had no way to develop it. She taught them technique, yes, but more importantly, she taught them that music was about more than perfection. It was about truth, about expressing what words couldn't say. Henry became her assistant, helping set up lessons and learning humility. Alongside the children, Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Kim coordinated the scholarship program that had grown substantially after news of Margaret's return spread. On quiet evenings, Margaret would play for small gatherings at the community center. Not formal concerts, just music shared among friends. Sometimes she'd play Rachmaninoff, sometimes Chopin, sometimes simple pieces that her students could appreciate. She kept the photograph of David and Lily on her piano at home now. Not hidden in a drawer, but out where she could see them, where they could watch her play. Because she finally understood that she hadn't been honoring them by hiding her gift. She honored them by sharing it, by letting the music they'd loved continue to live in the world. Margaret Chen had disappeared 30 years ago, broken by tragedy. But she'd returned, not in spite of her pain, but because of it. Stronger, deeper, more human, and the music she made now carried all of it. The joy and the sorrow, the loss and the survival, the darkness and the light that comes after.